in the film and just about women in power in journalism. So first of all, we have Charo Henriquez from the New York Times. Then we have Enrique Acevedo with Univision Noticias.
And we have Carolina Moreno from the HuffPost. And Joel Simon from CPJ.
You gotta work through that.
Oh, really? Yeah, there you go. All right,
For
let's
that,
get
for our
started.
live audience. So
There you go.
Thank you so much. Go ahead. Ladies first.
So, hi, everybody. How about that movie? Isn't that incredible? I'm sorry, I have the cough drop on my mouth because I have a raspy throat. I'm a big news nerd, so this kinds of things where I get to see the history and cases that we've heard about and seen about and learned about in school, seeing them come to life when the stories are told, to me, it's just very exciting and very, very thrilling. So
I'm supposed to moderate, but I want to make this a conversation and just ask our panel what they thought about the movie. So Joe, what did you think about the movie?
Well, what did I think about the movie? I thought it was an amazing experience, just very, very moving to see. You know, it was moving on so many different levels. It was moving because there was this, although it was not my era precisely, I have memories of that news production being something that, I think that scene where you had the publisher, and then you had the editor, and then you had the newsroom, and then you had the printers, and then you had the drivers, and you saw this massive operation of people from different classes and backgrounds all united in this joint production of reporting, printing, and delivering the news. And that was really exciting to me. But you know, my work is to defend the rights of journalists around the world. And one of the things I just kept thinking about, I mean, this is really set in a domestic context, but this was really had a profound impact all over the world. Because think about what's happening in the background. You know, you've got the Soviet Union, you've got this sort of totalitarian system. In Latin America, you've got kind of the rise of the juntas that are coming to power. And yet here you have a newspaper. You know, not the newspaper was not what it is today. You know, it was represented as, you know, really kind of coming of age, and it took on the government, and it went on, as we saw at the end, to break the Watergate story, and that brought down the government, and that inspired a generation of journalists around the world. It ultimately sort of changed the world, and we can sort of talk about that. But that's what I came away with.
And it also added to the reputation of the American press, right?
Yeah,
I think.
Well, I mean, that's my point. I think that's so valuable. I mean, obviously, I think it's irreplaceable, and it's being damaged every day. But the notion that the government tried to stop the journalists from doing their job, and it failed. It failed. The institution supported it, inspired journalists around the world, and that ultimately, I think, changed the world, and I think that legacy is very much in jeopardy today.
I was asking Charo and Joe what they thought about the movie, and Joe just mentioned that he felt like it happened in another time, but I think for many of us it feels very familiar with the plot.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was gonna say that it changed the world, but obviously not enough. It's not something that we don't see. I think the tactics have changed a little bit in the way that the press is continually undermined by powers that be. Unfortunately, it's not something, you know, even in the U.S., but other places like in Mexico, in Latin America, we see those, we see people give up their lives for stories. They're really putting their lives at stake for the right to speak about the realities and the truth that are happening in the country. And obviously, I couldn't agree more, Joel, that I think it's the reason why journalists do what we do, because we feel that we owe it to the truth. we owe it to the people, and that this is why this movie really touched me, obviously, because I feel like it speaks to us as journalists. It speaks to why we do what we do, and what motivates us. Obviously, in hindsight is 2020, and I think when you're in it, when you're making those decisions, you don't realize maybe the magnitude. You don't realize the possibility that this could be doing more harm than good, and that's not to say that the press hasn't made mistakes over the years, but it's important that we'll be allowed to do what we do and learn from it as well.
And hopefully it will resonate not only with journalists but with the general public at a time where trust in the media, where the credibility of the media, the reputation of the media, and I hate saying the media because it's not one thing,
It's not one,
so
yeah.
many things.
Absolutely.
But hopefully it will resonate with the general public.
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, in my organization where I work, obviously we are being looked at very critically, and it is our responsibility, and we rise to that responsibility, and we take it on head on. And for us, it's very important, and it's very mission driven, and it's what we do. It's our responsibility to get the message out, to break those stories, to change the conversation. Right now, this whole conversation about sexual harassment, and this was broken by two fantastic women journalists at the Times, and it has changed the conversation completely, and it's now a movement, and it's now a much bigger conversation because of those stories, and because we tell those stories.
And this is a perfect gateway into the lead character of the movie. This strong portrait. If anyone here hasn't read the autobiography by Ms. Graham, you should, because it's one of the best journalism books I think that you can read. Just overall, one of the best autobiographies that you can read. But let's talk a little bit about the lead character and the role Catherine Graham had, not only in building the Washington Post what it is today, but in protecting freedom of the press and the reputation of the independent media in the U.S. all over the world. Yeah.
Well, as a woman and as a woman of color, I can say that obviously the things that Spielberg did were very, very intentional. That when we see her going up to the Supreme Court, going out of the Supreme Court and seeing her go through woman, and seeing women look up to her, and that scene with the assistant of her, I actually don't know what her role was, but she was carrying the files. I think that was an important part. There's a reason it's not just kind of a dismissive way. It's Spielberg in many ways throughout the film told us the importance of seeing this woman. With Sarah Paulson's character as well. She when she was talking to her husband about what is it about that, if you're told enough that you don't belong somewhere, that your voice doesn't matter, you start to believe it. And I feel that's so true, especially for journalists of color in newsrooms, and also just people of color in the United States. If you're told that your voice doesn't matter, your life doesn't matter, you kind of a little part of you feels like you should shrink away. And that's the difference now. We're seeing people stand up and say my voice matters, and so I can relate to that. I feel like all those things happen in waves, and back then a woman in that role was hard to see, and my hope is that one day we can also start seeing more people of color in the newsroom taking those positions as well.
Absolutely. We've done good progress with women in leadership positions in media, but we certainly have to do much better.
Diversity in general.
Diversity in general.
And not only gender, but race, points of view.
Absolutely, but women, and women in color in particular, we're very, very underrepresented.
Right.
And we're being a little more visible, and representation matters a lot. And this is why she and I are sitting right here, so that we are here representing, so other people can see that we are here and are empowered by that.
Definitely. And Joel, how possible is to see a figure like Catherine Graham in a newsroom today? How much decision-making power do publishers have in this media environment where you see much more of a corporate influence in even in editorial decisions than what we saw
Yeah,
back then.
I mean, I think that the
Bottom line, the
Yeah,
fact
I
that
mean,
the
I
pressure on
I mean,
performance.
I think it, you know, Catherine Graham, and the first thing I'll say about Catherine Graham is there's been a lot of progress in the newsroom. There's a lot less progress on the business side, you know, and she's still a unique figure. And I think, I mean, because those, nobody, you know, those a lot of those are, you know, her circumstances put her in this situation, but there really are very few women. You're starting to see women come into leadership positions in the newsroom, but in the publishing world, there's a lot more progress that needs to be made. In terms of that relationship, you know, the sort of Chinese wall and how that was portrayed between the news side and the publisher, you know, there's a lot made about, you know, how solid that wall is, but I think they really caught that. It's, you know, it's a negotiated, it's a norm. It's really about respect between the publisher and the editor, and the two characters really captured that. I mean, ultimately, the way it was presented is you know, Catherine Graham had the power to intervene in the newsroom. She had a very strong editor who resisted her intervention, and she respected her role. So that's what kept that dynamic. That's what created that dynamic and allowed it to exist. And I think it captured that very well. And norms can change, and behavior can change, and there's nothing that's structurally preventing that from happening.
I want to ask the people who are here with us, how many of you are journalists? And if you can raise your hand. So most of them, not all of them. And how did this movie remind you of the reasons why you became a journalist? I mean, did you think about that while you were watching the movie, and it made you feel that, you know, of course, this is why we became a reporter, right?
This is why we do what we do, yeah.
And did you get that reaction from?
I am like I said, a journalism nerd, so I have always been so in love with my profession, with what I do. It's what I've always wanted to do and what I've done for 21 years.
And I guess my question, Charo, is, does it feel more consequential right now than ever
journalism
before?
has always been consequential, as we can see. Speaking truth to power has always been consequential, has always been important, and it remains important because that's the job, and we can't lose sight of what the job is.
I think unfortunately right now as an industry we're facing several different obstacles. Some of them are internal, some of them are external. Obviously politically, externally, and not just politically but also like the people in the United States. There's a sense of growing mistrust against the press. But internally, for, you know, a while now, we've been, you know, talking about the death of print media, and we've been talking about, you know, and when you talk about the publishers, we talk about the business side, we talk about profitability and how that's going to translate in the digital age. And that growing curve in journalism, coupled with that external pressure and that external obstacles that we have, is definitely sincerely you know, what makes it very difficult to be a journalist right now. But at the same time, it's one of those moments in time where journalism, the face of journalism is going to change while the heart remains the same. You know, the kind of things that we saw in this movie, the kind of principles and ethics, those are still at the heart of what we do every day. But as you know, I was surprised to see that process too, because I was never part of, you know, I wasn't a journalist during that time. I know I look really young today. But I was never a journalist at the time, and just seeing that process really gave me a lot of perspective as far as, like, you know, what it took to be a journalist and the things that people did at the time with less resources. And now we have more resources, and I think once we overcome that learning curve, you know, journalism, it's going to be limitless. The opportunities for us.
And for so long, Joe, when we met, I used to work as a reporter for Reforma, a newspaper in Mexico. I was brought up to print, and freedom of the press was a real issue, I thought, in Mexico, an everyday issue, an every story issue. And when I came to the U.S. Around 10 years ago, it didn't feel that way. When I came to school at Columbia and I graduated here and then went back, it did, and then came back to the U.S. and it never felt like it was an issue. And all of a sudden, it is. again, and you just mentioned, now we're concentrating some of our resources in protecting journalists here in the U.S., which many of us never thought it could happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think what this is a reminder of is that it's a battle. You know, no, freedom of the press is something you have to actively defend every day. And the battles, I mean, one thing to keep in mind is the whole First Amendment framework, the notion that the government can't censor the media. I mean, that was the battle that played out in 1971. Before that, that was really an open question. You know, can the government impose prior restraint? It had not been resolved. And the whole First Amendment framework is a relatively recent concept. It really emerged in the 1960s. So, and if you look at, you know, journalists who were covering the civil rights movement in the 1960s, they faced the kind of violence, threats, and intimidation that we think of now in places like Latin America. So this is a very recent phenomenon, and it's periodically threatened, and we have to, you know, figure out how to rally together to defend it. And there are a couple of instances in the movie. First of all, the solidarity,
right,
in the media. That was something that, you know, I think Spielberg was trying to make a point about that, and the relationship between the New York Times and the Washington Post, these fierce rivals, and the you know, how they backed each other, and also the other newspapers that printed. But the other thing I want to mention is,
and even television, you know, were feeding off the newspaper.
Absolutely. But the other thing that's really important to keep in mind is these were powerful institutions with we saw their lawyers. You know, these were fought in the courtroom. They had general counsels, they had legal teams. These were powerful institutions that had the ability to wage that legal battle. There are certain institutions like that today, but they're not as many. They're fewer, and it's much more difficult to marshal the kinds of resources you need to win those kinds of legal victories.
And you think what has happened and what we saw in the campaigns, what we've seen from the White House during the first 11 months of the administration, has eroded the strength of some of these institutions?
I don't believe it has. I think that is still the job. It is still our responsibility to cover these things, to give voice to people who don't have voices, to bring these things to light. I sincerely believe that it's still our mission and that we're still doing that job.
I think at the same
Carolina.
I do think that it's still our job, and I don't think that's ever changed. But I do think that, you know, when I was watching the movie, and at the end of the Supreme Court, when I saw those banners that said like "Free the Press," you know, things like that. I you know, who's to say that wasn't like a Hollywood thing? Who's to say if people were actually out there? I haven't seen a picture or video or anything, but you know, if I was like, wow, I wonder if that would happen today. If people would rally behind the press the way they did back then. And I don't, you know, maybe I'm a little cynical. I don't know if they would.
So some of the signs that we've seen today are actually.
Yeah, it speaks to the contrary, and you know, I'm not a media critic, and I wouldn't really know to tell you at what point in time the people kind of just stopped believing in the press, or not everybody, but I do feel there's definitely been a shift, but I do believe that there's still people that at the core believe that the press is here to check the government and be the fourth estate.
So a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. The first one is right at the end of the movie, Katharine Graham says something like, well, we're not perfect. We don't always get it right, but that's the job, right? We keep trying, we keep working on this.
Mm-hmm.
How important is it to be more transparent and more accountable to our readers, to our audiences in this environment, especially in this environment? And I'll let everyone answer that question.
And in my opinion, it's key. Transparency is key. And again, that's our mission. In our case, we do see via the volume of subscriptions, how people are supporting our journalism, our connection to our audience. Our business model is different than other places because people do subscribe, people do pay for our report
More than ever, probably.
because of the quality, more than ever. Why is that? Because people are supporting our journalism, because of the quality of the report, because of the transparency, because of how thorough we are. And that, to me, represents trust. And they may not be like marching outside and supporting us, but that's the way how people are supporting us. They're supporting the Post. People are now paying for the journalistic mission. Not in every newspaper, not in every case, but the reason why subscriptions are up is because people are supporting our journalism. But it has to be quality journalism that is transparent, that is doing the hard job, the investigations, putting those resources behind our report.
That's a great point. Harry?
Yes, I 100% agree, believe me. And I'm only here to be devil's advocate.
No, absolutely.
But you know, I think there's something to be said about when we see films like this, and we see films like Spotlight, and we look internally at our own newsrooms. And I can't speak to any other newsrooms, but I know that there's been a shift. You know, there's a shift from investigative journalism that to something quicker, to something that you know, instead of funneling funds into month-long investigations, sometimes we're seeing newspapers like do something shorter, do something, and I'm not saying that you know, any of our publications are doing that.
No.
But what I'm saying is that and that comes from a business side, right? That comes from, you know, how much, for a long time, you know, newspapers were losing money or something like that, and they started cutting. They started cutting staff, they started cutting. And some of the first places to go were the investigative teams. And I think that the New York Times actually does a wonderful job at still doing and being committed to these long-term, the Harvey Weinstein, you know, it's the perfect, and it's a perfect example. But I think that we need more on the business as more newspapers to be stepping up that game and being part of that same mission, because it can't be the New York, it can't just be the New York Times for the press to work the way it does.
Absolutely.
I think what's interesting about the kind of New York Times and Washington Post in that period is they were very trusted, but they were definitely not transparent. They were very opaque institutions. No one had any idea what went on inside the New York Times and how the decisions were made. And boy, if you had a problem, if you disagreed with a story, it was impenetrable. And the same with the Post. So I think that transparency and trust are two different things. So the media was trusted, but it wasn't transparent. I don't think in this era, because of the moment in which we live, you could have trust without transparency, but in that era you could. But one thing that's really interesting about the Supreme Court decision in the Pentagon Papers is basically what the underlying principle was. The Supreme Court basically deferred to the judgment of the editors of these responsible institutions that they felt served the public interest. And the question I have is, would the courts defer to the judgment of the media in today's environment? And that's why trust is so important. And that's why, you know, having those people in the street, okay, it's a narrative vehicle, but it's an important point, because the media, when it comes under threat, its only defense that it has is the trust and support that it has from the public. Without that, when it comes under threat, and let's face it, the media is under threat right now. It's resisting, but it's under threat. That is critical. That is critical. You have to preserve that.
And let's get a little practical for students who are here. I know that the representatives of the chapters from Colombia and CUNY are both here, and some students also. In my experience, when I was a young reporter in the newsroom at the newspaper at Colombia at school, so they teach you the craft. They teach you how to do the story, how to do it right, how to do the reporting, how to go about the legwork. But and in my school, at least, and in my newspaper, they put an emphasis on the ethical questions, the moral issues that you would confront at some point. But in all honesty, I don't think we are as prepared for that side of what we do as we are for the technical, the craft side, right? And there's a point in your career, inevitably, that you will face those questions, those ethical, moral issues. And this movie is more about that than anything else. They don't spend too much time on whether the lead was the right lead or not, and how long was
30
the
minutes.
not draft, and how many sources, 34, okay, well, 32, 1.5, whatever. But they do spend a lot of time on those moral, ethical questions that all of the reports in this room, and I'm guessing all of us in this panel have faced or will face at some point in our careers. How do we do a better job of training the next generation of reporters to deal with those ethical and moral issues?
We do it. We train them. We pose those questions. We teach about these examples and these moments in history and the moments that we're living right now. And we make them think critically about those things. And it's not just about how many followers you have or the volume of whether you're an influencer or not. That's not what matters ultimately. That's the difference between creating content and creating journalism. And that was something that I borrowed from our publisher who said this yesterday. We do journalism, we do content, so I'm going to credit AG also for that. Right now, there's such blurred lines between what is journalism and what is content. And in an online environment, this is why, and I'm not going to say the F word, that fake news. Like that's not, this is how lines get blurred between what's news, what's journalism, and what's online content. What is a blog versus what is a newspaper or a reputable news publication? It's the ethics. It's the thoroughness in your report. It's how you vet your sources. It's the fact checking. It is all those things that go with the craft of the journalism that don't necessarily go into creating content to push out a marketing funnel or a digital platform or any of these, and I'm not gonna say newfangled things because I've been an online journalist for 17 years and I've been an online journalist for 17 years, not a content creator, nor not a digital media blank. I've been a journalist in digital platforms for 17 years. And the difference is that it's the ethics, it's the care of the craft, it's the pride in what you do, and having that little badge of honor of being a journalist and not a content creator or an influencer.
And online journalism has faced its
Okay,
criticism. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm speaking from, I work for...
I'm here as the ambassador of all online journalists.
we were the, and I say this with a sense of pride, we're the first outlet to be banned from covering the Trump campaign. One of our journalists was actually kicked out of one of his press conferences. But when that happened, they said, most of the mainstream media said that we weren't following the traditional principles of journalism. Now most of the outlets that said that are actually doing some of the reporting and the kind of reporting that we did at that point that got us the ban. And I think the Huffington Post was also one of the first platforms to react to what was happening in the campaign.
Okay, what was the question?
So the question
what is the question?
Well, we were talking about ethics and
Right.
moral issues.
Is HuffPost ethical? Is that your question?
About the ethics.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think at the core, and like I was saying before, you're totally right. The internet is a double-edged sword. You know, we talk. It's filled with misinformation, and at the same time, it is filled with great journalism. And you know, I think on one hand, we in journalism school, and I think we should be making sure that we're focusing on, you know, teaching students ethics and having them go through ethics courses. On the other hand, and I feel like that sense of journalism is at HuffPost, if that was the question. And there are a lot of amazing people doing amazing work, but the way, you know, and like I was talking about earlier, like there's a learning curve. There's a learning curve about the way a publication that's only online can function within an audience. And I think that's something that HuffPost was a pioneer in. And it's something that, as a pioneer, we're just trying to sort through, just kind of like every other public. You know, the New York Times also is creating an online press. Well, has been creating for a while longer.
Has had it for 20 odd years.
Yeah. and we're all learning in that sense, and we're all learning that with those kind of things, it's different. It's different going immediately online, and than it is when going, to press the next day. With that said, I completely forgot what I was gonna say. So you're gonna look at your
Ethics.
ethics.
Like how the importance of rigor in the process, in the editorial process,
Yeah.
to follow online.
Yeah, but I also think that we don't talk enough about also learning people, teaching people to be smart consumers of news. And I think in this day and age, in the digital age, literacy is equally important. When we talk about, especially when we talk about, a lot of times when we discuss media today, we talk about liberal media, conservative media. And I always tell people that I personally don't believe that it's not a partisan issue. It's not about being liberal. It's not about being conservative. Journalism should be the only thing it should matter is the truth. And unfortunately, I don't think that that's the case for all media outlets today. But politics are best left out when you talk about what you're reporting. You're talking about ethics. You're talking about the truth. But I think right now it's become a political game to kind of pinpoint it. Some outlets as liberal, some outlets as conservative, and so on.
It has, without doubt. And Joel, you get the last word.
Oh, well, boy, the last word. Well, look, I'm a fan of journalism schools, although I never went to one. But some of the best journalists I've ever encountered have never been to journalism school, never been taught ethics, journalism ethics, and there's something really beautiful and simple about the best journalism, about the principles of journalism, and I think that came across in the movie. But if you just tell someone, journalism is driven by a certain human impulse, storytelling impulse, which is to know and understand your surroundings and communicate your knowledge to other people. And if you say to somebody who's got those impulses, and some people are just born with them, if you say kind of, be as truthful as you can, and be fair. And objective, that's a kind of, we can debate that forever, but be fair. Be fair. People know what fair is. Yeah. People, if they just sort of follow their conscience, and they know what trying as hard as you can to be truthful, it doesn't mean you're perfect, but it means your intention is to be truthful and your intention is to be fair. And if you follow those principles, you can have a sort of a high-minded debate about ethics, but if you follow those principles, you kind of get most of the way there.
Joel, Carolina, Charo, and our hosts today, thank you so much for the invitation. Thanks for letting me skip a night of work to go to the movies. And I hope you enjoyed as much as we did. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are we off the air? So now we can curse?